Mr. Speaker, I rise to make my fourth contribution to the sectoral debates in the life of this current Parliament for the second time as Shadow Minister of Housing. I rise, Mr. Speaker, recognizing that I am able to do so and to speak today because of the grace and mercy of the Almighty who has given me strength and perseverance to serve the people. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank my wife and children who have stood with me over the years of my political parliamentary representation and who have allowed me to give the time to give to the process, even at the expense of family time. She'll be here shortly, but my daughter, Kim, is here. And to say to them all, enough love and respect. To my constituents who have given me the power to be here for this fourth term. I heard you were in Paji. I thank them and pledge my continued commitment to work towards making Central St. Mary a better place. To my constituency executive committee members who are here, two of my councillors, my driver, and my many workers, my housing task force, supporters and friends, I want to publicly thank you for your encouragements, your work and your support over the year. To my party leader, Dr. Peter Phillips. Thanks for his confidence in me by assigning me to this portfolio. I want also to thank my colleagues on both sides of the House for their support, their criticisms at times, and for the healthy banter which exists at all times, sometimes aim to make a little light of some of the mundane matters before us here in the House. To you, Mr. Speaker. To you, Mr. Speaker. For your advice at times, your counsel, and although a few times you have not seen eye to eye, even to the point of you calling my name as a member during a sitting when the cut and thrust of Parliament was at a particularly high point, I commend you on your stewardship. Sober at times, and at times bringing hilarity to the House. Mr. Speaker, many times people have asked me why I enter representational politics. My simple answer is to serve. Many ask what satisfaction I get from serving. My answer is that it comes in many ways. Seeing a better place for people, seeing the joy on the faces of children and adults alike when something positive happens in their school or community as a result of my intervention or stewardship. Meeting someone on the street and them saying, MP, you might not remember me, but you helped me through university and I'm working now. And too many other examples to mention, Mr. Speaker. On the other side, Mr. Speaker, some satisfaction comes from some very touching events. I recall one such event, Mr. Speaker. A family of 5 had been burnt out. Fortunately, their house was sited on a concrete base. So it didn't take much to help to rebuild a rudimentary but sufficient structure. Within 2 days after the fire, with the help of neighbors and local tradesmen, they were back in a house. To my pleasant and still tear-evoking memories, Mr. Speaker, the 9-year-old child presented herself, the daughter presented herself to my office on her way to school one day, about 2 days after the house was completed. She stopped at the pharmacy to buy a thank you card. She didn't get that, so she bought a Christmas card and wrote in it the thanks and appreciation of her parents and her siblings as well as herself for my assisting in helping them in their time of need. This, Mr. Speaker, I found was done on her own initiative without her parents knowing. It brought tears to my eyes, Mr. Speaker, and it's things like those that gives me the energy to continue serving in this capacity. Last year, Mr. Speaker, I spoke to many areas of the housing portfolio. In that presentation, I commented on the tardiness of the government in which many deliverables from this portfolio were being handled. This, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sorry the Prime Minister is not here, is attributable to inadequate oversight and leadership, and the Prime Minister, who holds ultimate responsibility, has too many irons in the fire. Mr. Speaker, the most important goal that has to be prioritized at this point in time by the government through the Ministry of Housing and its various agencies is to identify innovative solutions to expand affordable housing opportunities, especially for the thousands of middle and low-income earners who have traditionally faced the greatest barrier to home ownership in Jamaica. Housing currently, Mr. Speaker, falls under the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation. So does water, the UDC, NEPA, Port Authority of Jamaica, and about 30 other departments and agencies. All these named agencies have had oversight problems. And what you see, Mr. Speaker, is a case typified by the phrase, it's going to try and serve too many masters and end up not serving any of them. We have had 3 ministers without portfolio with responsibility for housing since my presentation last year. What? Minister Chang, Minister Samuda, and now Minister Charles. We have not had any coherent policy coming from the portfolio since this administration, Mr. Speaker. Yes. It is good and commendable, and certainly something this side supports, the thrust by the National Housing Trust to build more houses for the people of Jamaica, with a target of 22,000 houses by 2020. But, Mr. Speaker, this has to be done in a policy framework which guides the government. As I said last year, Mr. Speaker, and will iterate again, the housing policy is languishing in the ministry. This is what I said last year, and I quote, when we left office in 2016, we left a final draft of that policy. We would expect that with the new administration, there would be some changes. But it cannot be, Mr. Speaker, that the changes have been so monumental that it's taken upwards of 2 years to achieve these amendments. The then minister without portfolio, with responsibility for housing in the sectoral presentation in 2016, committed to the House to have this national housing policy in a short period of time. To date, 2 years down the road, Mr. Speaker, this policy has not been laid, unquote. That, Mr. Speaker, was last year. We are now in 2019 and still no inkling of what is to happen. Again, I call on the minister, the Prime Minister, to put some urgency to this matter. I move to the National Housing Trust, Mr. Speaker. Coupled with that, in the throne speech of 2018-2019, this is what the Governor General said, and I quote, the strategic review of the National Housing Trust was completed in November 2017. The review will be brought to Parliament in the first quarter of this fiscal year for discussion and implementation of accepted recommendations within the context of our Vision 2030 goals should begin soon thereafter, unquote. The Prime Minister tabled the NHT strategic review in March 2018 and committed to a debate in the House of the recommendations which would form the new policy of the National Housing Trust going forward. On October 3, 2018, at the groundbreaking of the Maxfield Park Housing Development Project, he committed to having this debate done in the House before the end of the year. This is what he said then, and I quote, "It is already a very packed parliamentary agenda, but I believe we should go into next year with a decided vision, both government and opposition, as to what will be the future of the NHT," unquote. Nothing done so far, Mr. Speaker, in furtherance of that. And we again note the Governor General in the throne speech this year, 2019-2020, said the strategic review will be debated this year. This is what he said. The NHT strategic review, which was already tabled, will be debated in this honorable House this year to strategically inform the approach to the housing sector, unquote. But, Mr. Speaker, 2 years of promises. It is now hoped that it will be done this budget year. We cannot wait any longer on this slow-paced approach, and therefore urge the Prime Minister to have this debate so the final directive on the future of the NHT can have bipartisan support. Mr. Speaker, we note the Prime Minister's announcement last year and reinforced this year of the outreach activity of the NHT to build police stations, repair existing ones, doing other projects in areas nearby to existing schemes. The Minister of Local Government thanking the NHT for infirmary refurbishing and installation of standby generators. And while this is a welcomed move and one which ought to be supported, Mr. Speaker, and certainly one which this side supports, our concern is whether the law governing the operations of the National Housing Trust are being breached. And why do I say that, Mr. Speaker? The NHT Board of 2012-2016 in the last PNP administration, in an effort to utilize NHT funds to repair a ward in an infirmary, as well as other public sector projects, was presented with a legal opinion that it would not be possible under the present law, and that what would be needed was an amendment of the statute to allow for that. This, Mr. Speaker, would be analogous to the amendment for the requirement to get the $5 billion for the Education Transformation Program in 2005, and further amendment in 2013 for the amount of $11.5 billion yearly for 4 years, and the second amendment for the further 4 years in 2017 for the same amount each year for fiscal consolidation as per the National Housing Trust Amendment Special Provision Acts of 2013 and 2017. Certainly, Mr. Speaker, those proposed construction activities do not fall in the category of fiscal consolidation, and nothing in the present law allows for that. If there were provisions, or if there are provisions, Mr. Speaker, would like the Minister, who is the Prime Minister, to present to House a legal opinion. And if none, bring an amendment to the Act to allow for these pending activities. Certainly, Mr. Speaker, this House would not want the government to break the laws for expediency, and whether this speaks to the Machiavellian approach this government has taken to governance. The decision of the further amendment in 2017 means, Mr. Speaker, the total take for the NHT for the 4 + 4 years between 2013 and 2021 would be a total of $90 billion. The government of the day in 2013 came under pressure for this withdrawal, but had legislated to last 4 years as part of the conditionality of the IMF Extended Fund Facility Program of 2013-2017. Threatened, we were taken to court. With the successor program of 2017, the standby arrangement, though the additional funds were technically not needed, the government again tapped the NHT for another 45 billion over the succeeding 4 years. And calculations show, Mr. Speaker, that by 2021, diverted funds will average about 30% of the total contributions paid into the NHT since its inception. Having said that, I will echo the warning of the danger of us drifting further and further from the trust mandate and in the process committing a grave social injustice against the thousands of regular contributors who have yet to access mortgages for either home construction, repair, upgrade, or purchase. To conclude, Mr. Speaker, on the NHT, let me highlight once again what seemed to be a practice that has always bothered me, where each time the NHT increases the maximum beneficiary amounts, the price of a standard two-bedroom house increases. When the ceiling was 4.5 million per contributor, with a couple getting 9 million, the value of the said unit was around 10. When it went to 5.5, the value of that reference unit went to 12 to 13 million. Now we see the benefits going to 6.5 million, and the price of those same type of houses are reaching 14 to 16 million. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we could even go back in time to the benefits of 3.5 and see the same pattern. There has never been a situation where these types of units have been built and have not been sold. So it begs the question as to whether the developers are jacking up the prices based on the NHT setting the tone. Is the NHT unwittingly causing the price of houses to their beneficiaries to be increased, Mr. Speaker? The economists will answer that by saying that pricing is determined by demand and supply. But I would want the NHT to commission a study on this particularly because of their potential culpability. We need to know which is the chicken and which is the egg.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I understand that my wife is here.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Probably at this time, Mr. Speaker, with the level of priority being placed on a sector as critical to national development as housing, a thought for serious consideration. Also, given the enormity of the settlement challenges in this country, I feel it is time that the Ministry of Housing revert to the standalone ministry and the portfolio minister be given carriage and full responsibility for the NHT as well as the other agencies within the portfolio. The synergies, Mr. Speaker, would be very significant and proper oversight would undoubtedly be realized. Mr. Speaker, whilst the government is with full dispatch building houses with an estimated target of 23,000 by 2021 through the NHT, the plight of the poorest in this country is being neglected. When the contract to construct low-income houses between Jeep and Food for the Poor came to an end in September 2017, the country was promised first that the contract would have been renewed. JIS reported on May 30, 2017 at a meeting with the Prime Minister and officials from Food for the Poor that the Prime Minister committed to continuing the program. The Prime Minister said then that the, and I quote, government values the partnership with Food for the Poor. This partnership has my full support as it affords needy Jamaicans a home with modern amenities, which is delivered well below market rate at no cost to the recipient. At present, it costs US $6,400 to deliver a unit, with government providing $3,200 of the amount and Food for the Poor providing the remaining amount. Today, unquote, to date, Mr. Speaker, nothing. But what we see is just hopscotching. We were subsequently told that a government program was being launched to build houses under the whole program, utilizing individuals trained under the HARD program. The Prime Minister announced that in his budget speech in March this year, and then said Minister Samuda would speak to it. But that minister is currently superintending education, and again, nothing to date. Apart from what was said in the throne speech, Mr. Speaker, and the Prime Minister mentioning it, nothing has been said in the House further about the program. But, Mr. Speaker, this Parliament has been disrespected when the only other information available was the exclusive story carried in Jamaica Observer of June 7, 4 days ago, of plans by the newly appointed National Director to roll out the program. Mr. Speaker, the members of this House, certainly the members on this side of the House, feel slighted and demand that the Prime Minister immediately advise this House about his social housing program. We need to hear what the plans are, what is planned for the indigent, what the arrangements are, and what is the arrangements are for the poor within the society. We have lost 2 years of housing provisions for this sector, Mr. Speaker. Is this how we treat that segment of the population who depend on the support of the state to survive? As a country, are we being true to the international conventions we have signed on to, declaring the right to housing as a fundamental human right? Is this what we call prosperity, Mr. Speaker? But then again, Mr. Speaker, we were reminded in 2018 that prosperity is only in the mind. Prosperity. But having said that, Mr. Speaker, though the full details of the program have not been revealed, there is sufficient evidence based on utterances that this will be undertaken by Hope, with a strong emphasis on graduates of the NYS hard program. And having heard that, Mr. Speaker, I couldn't help but reflecting on the last 2 PNP manifestos, which speak to a youth build program of 2011 and a parish-based construction brigade of 2016, drawn from hard-trained students with requisite qualification. If that is so, Mr. Speaker, the implementation is welcome, and adoption of proposal is sound and demonstrate that good ideas can cross political administrations. Mr. Speaker, inertia in the portfolio is further compounded by the wait for 3 years for the amendment to the Rent Restriction Act. Mr. Speaker, I spearheaded significant work on that, revising the act leading up to the change of government in 2016. But to date, no bill has been tabled in the Parliament. In fact, again, then Minister Chang spoke to the modernization of the Rent Restriction Act. At the 7th public consultation, Minister Samuda said, and I quote, "You have my 100% support as Minister with responsibility for the area in ensuring that whatever changes are made to this Rent Restriction Act are done as quickly as possible." In April of this year, at the end of April, Minister Charles said that the government was updating the Rent Restriction Act to create a viable rental industry and provide equity for tenants and landlords. Oh boy. Mr. Speaker, each time one of the 3 ministers spoke to the amendment of the Act, it seemed as if the wheel is being reinvented. As I remarked earlier on, significant work was already done when we left office in 2016. In 2018, Mr. Speaker, I spoke to the significant delay and tardiness of the government in doing the work for the tabling of proposed Rent Act. The last board of the PNP administration made significant recommendations, and these were adopted and paved the way for public consultations. Why has it taken in excess of 3 years to complete this process? This delay, Mr. Speaker, has significant negative impact on the potential for the rental market and hampers the ability of young professionals and college students to access affordable accommodation within a structured framework. One of the recommendations, Mr. Speaker, was that the new act would provide equity for landlords and tenants and this could pave the way for an expansion in housing construction in the rental market. With this, Mr. Speaker, coupled with our recommended state incentive policy for that sector, the construction of more units for the rental market would result in a massive expansion of the construction sector. Mr. Speaker, the government has announced that the Jamaica Mortgage Bank is to be privatized. This agency provides a necessary service to the housing construction sector with the provisions of loan to private developers. The bank has made a turnaround since 2014 when the new board and new management assumed control. The challenge the equity faced was undercapitalization and hence restricted the reach to unlend more loans to private developers. This undercapitalization, Mr. Speaker, has caused the JMB to seem to be not performing as it should, which is the principal reason driving the decision to privatize. Let me caution this House again, Mr. Speaker, that this is a wrong move. Efforts to capitalize it during the last administration were prevented by the inability of the Ministry of Finance to provide a government guarantee for a bond issue due to the IMF program. And hence the bank is in the position it is currently because of undercapitalization and is unable to satisfy the many private developers who come knocking on the doors.
That's right.
Let me therefore suggest that to remedy that situation, Mr. Speaker, other routes to keep this entity open, this entity in the government should be looked at and should include the Ministry of Finance exploring the option of capitalizing the bank with at least $3 billion based on the proposal in 2014-15 for a bond issue.
That's right. That's right.
Another proposal, Mr. Speaker, would be for the NHT to lend the Jamaica Mortgage Bank the funds it invests in the capital market, which is currently getting at 2 to 3% interest rates, whilst the JMB could pay 5 to 6% interest, earning a net of 2 to 3 percentage points more in terms of profits for the NHT. I also suspect, Mr. Speaker, that there are other proposals that could be examined.
That's right.
Additionally, Mr. Speaker, the Jamaica Mortgage Bank administers the Mortgage Insurance Act as well as provides a secondary mortgage market. What assurances or safeguards will be in place for the administration of these to benefit the Jamaican people were the bank to be privatized? Mr. Speaker, there are about $600 billion of pension fund in the market, and most of it is lying in financial or banking institutions. Interest rates are quite low now, so the returns on these funds are correspondingly low to the funds. I am told that currently the regulation governing pension funds allow a threshold of 5% for real estate holdings. The proposal is mooted that they should be increased to 15 to 20%, and this is something that the regulators can look at, as this, Mr. Speaker, could give a large boost to the housing sector, but also, Mr. Speaker, bring down the prices of units to the home buyer, as more houses will be on the market, and the economists will then be true to form in that supply and demand will determine the prices.
Teach them, Morais, teach them.
The experience in Chile is that pension funds are used almost exclusively for housing and infrastructural development, and that has been a driver for their growth. Over to you, Minister of Finance.
Come. Step up.
I now turn to the Housing Agency of Jamaica. This entity, Mr. Speaker, has been ambling along.
Ambling, good word.
Whilst management has been steering the entity,
Excellent.
the overall performance of the agency has been lackluster. We have been told that the agency has been in a profitable mode over the past 3 years. But this profitability, Mr. Speaker, is unsustainable if new projects are not undertaken urgently. The newfound profitability of the HAJ is primarily due to the selling of units and assets which have been in the ground for some time and were not sold. The majority constructed during the previous administration. We have been told that the long-standing project at Bernard Lodge has been at the agency for years, has finally been contracted to a Chinese firm for construction and development. We need to know what is the current status of that project, Mr. Speaker.
Sufficient to finish. Mr. Warmington, the member time for speaking expired.
There's only one speaker, man.
Order, please. Order, please.
By the rules. 10 minutes? Mr. Speaker, I ask that the Speaker's time be extended by 10 minutes to allow him to complete his presentation.
Members, if you have a problem, complain to the Speaker. You cannot be quarreling across the floor. Mr. Warmington, the motion is?
15.
That the Speaker's time, I've already asked him, Mr. Speaker, that the Speaker's time be extended by 10 minutes to allow him to complete his presentation.
Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Doctor, you may proceed.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the members of this honorable House. Shooters Hill was another project that was left on the books for development. What is the status, the current status? And where is the Grange Pen development for St. James? Thank you, House Leader. Mr. Speaker, until these projects are commenced, the HAJ will find itself in the red again. And soon, if there are no developments, no new developments in a timely manner.
That's right.
What this means, therefore, is the thrust by the government in building more houses is being hampered by the non-performance of the HAJ. And Mr. Speaker, the chest beating of the Prime Minister in calling himself the builder will be faltered because of this inadequacy of the HAJ. The Housing Agency of Jamaica started a titling program in 2012 aimed at getting persons living in formerly occupied settlements, originally part of the Operation Pride project, to become titled. The drive was fairly successful during the last administration. I will yield to your senior years at the ministry. I now see where efforts are being made by the HAJ to involve members of parliament and councillors in the drive to help getting the message out there. Where are we now with that, Mr. Speaker, and what targets have been achieved? In 2015, in my sectoral presentation, as Minister with responsibility for housing, I committed to having a program of distributing 15,000 titles per year from an estimated 45,000 in the possession of government. And this was against a background of having distributed thousands of titles in the previous years. That program, Mr. Speaker, was seemingly abandoned at the change of administration in 2016. Additionally, the National Land Titling Program also launched in 2015 with a view of coordinating all the ministries and agencies involved in land titling to expedite the process of getting titles to the people. But that too was abandoned by the JLP government in 2016. Mr. Speaker, we hear of a successor program, but that seemed to have fallen by the wayside. In March 2018, the Prime Minister announced a spend funded by the NHT of $2 billion to register 20,000 titles over a 3-year period. Having gone through 1 year, Mr. Speaker, nothing further has been heard since. Prime Minister, what is the status of this program? Last year, Mr. Speaker, I spoke to the regeneration of Kingston, and particularly the aspects of this development as it relates to housing. I will repeat this call this year, too. In none of the grand announcements made so far has there been an effort to provide significant housing units for all sectors in the redevelopment of Kingston? Recently, the Prime Minister announced that the 15 major construction projects are slated for Kingston and St. Andrew as part of the continued development of the corporate area. Interestingly though, Mr. Speaker, there has not been any attention directed at building more homes in those areas of Kingston which are suffering from urban blight. I have repeatedly mentioned that the costs associated with construction in those areas are significantly less than in the new greenfield sites, as roads, water, and sewage mains, irrespective of the state they are in, are already in place. We need, in the process, Mr. Speaker, to house people in properly zoned areas with shorter commute times to work. We need to redevelop Kingston with houses and homes so that we decrease the sprawl on the plains of St. Catherine and nearby parishes. Mr. Speaker, I could not end my presentation without referencing the utilization of agricultural lands for housing development. I not only make reference to the new Bernard Lodge Township development and the almost Nicodemus way in which the land was allocated to the persons and investors, but also to the many arable land across the country now being encased in concrete. Mr. Speaker, we hear the cry of the agricultural sector and bemoaning the loss of agricultural lands for housing, and rightly so. We need to look at non-arable lands, scrublands, and other areas to put houses. The constant buzzword nowadays is about climate change, and correctly so. But with the increasing climate change, but with increasing utilization of these agricultural lands and the denuding of other areas, we run the risk of leaving an island barren of trees and barren of water for our future generations. In closing, Mr. Speaker, the housing portfolio has operated in an environment of long delays, an environment of missed opportunities and uncertainties, and a haphazard manner. We need the housing policy to guide the sector's development. Promises and commitments made and none delivered in a timely manner. Evidence abound in the missed timelines for the debate on the NHT strategic review debate and the Rent Act. This important ministry cannot function on grand announcement with no more, as evidenced in the many pronouncements from the minister.
Who is the minister?
The poor and indigent of the country cannot wait on a government which has forgotten them for 3 years in the social housing program.
Can't wait.
What we have seen, Mr. Speaker, is a series of events which have no focus bearing on the provisions for a complete housing program for the country. You know, Mr. Speaker, a medical colleague of mine writing the Daily Glean a few days ago used the term hocus focus. He reasoned. He reasoned that just like the hocus pocus, that's the illusion of magic acts, our hocus focus give the illusion of solving, and I put here the housing challenges. This term typifies exactly in what the government is about, Mr. Speaker. But good governance demands more than this. Housing demands more. We on this side, we are demanding that the government stops this hopscotching and attend with more serious deliberations on this vital and important sector. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.